Watchmen is one of the most important titles in comic book history, but is it truly one of the best? Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Alan Moore and illustrated by Dave Gibbons, the first issue of Watchmen was published by DC Comics in September of 1986. And the book is set in an alternate 1985, and one night in New York, Edward Blake is murdered. As he was previously known as the masked adventurer the comedian, this sets off a chain of events for the remaining members of the Crime Busters, which was a team of costumed crime fighters that existed up until vigilantism was outlawed by the government. But as the mystery around Blake's murder deepens, this forces Rorschach, Night Owl, the Silk Spectre, Dr. Manhattan, and Ozymandias to confront both the pasts and the futures in a world that seems destined to be destroyed in an unavoidable World War III. I still really like the art, and I know it might seem that there's going to be some kind of British bias going on, but I just think that there's something deceptively simple about it. And that's a phrase that I've used quite a lot, and I do think it is applicable to this book, because Gibbons' line work is so clean cut that it does often seem that the shape is pretty much just what it is. Doesn't make sense. Because Gibbons' line work is precise in exactly what it's doing, so it didn't really need to have a sketchy quality to it. But there's just so much detail that goes into every single panel, and there's something about Watchmen, there's always something new that you'll notice. And I think a large part of that is just due to the art because of the fact that there's so much hidden in the background. And that's really the benefit of getting this in an absolute edition if you do like this story, which is something that you can still purchase from the channel's sponsor, Organic Price Books. And they've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer service, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And kind of like how people like coming back to this book, you can use that code as many times as you like. But regardless of which way you read it, I do think that there's still going to be something that you will notice, at least in one panel, every time that you come back to this book. On this reading in particular, I found myself following certain characters because of the fact that near enough every person is distinctive and unique. But not to take away credit from Gibbons, but the reason why there's so much vastness in this book, and I'm not even sure if vastness is a word, I really wanted to say too vast, too furious, but this excessive detail is probably thanks in large part to Alan Moore's scripts. You get a brief sample of it in the back of this Absolute Edition, and I'm sure that you can probably find it in other formats, but there's never really going to be an instance where an artist doesn't know what Alan Moore wants to see on the page. And for me, when I go back and look at those scripts, I often find myself wondering if it's easier or more difficult when you've got this approach, because it's so clear that there is a vision inside Alan Moore's mind, so when you turn in the pages, is it one of those cases that if it's slightly off, he'd send it back? I don't know, it's something that I'd be interested in finding out, but I do think it's great that there's so much of a clear direction that comes from the author. Another aspect of the art that I think can often get overlooked is the use of paneling. I love that this was a 3x3 format on near enough every page, but occasionally it'd open up and condense some of those boxes, but you never really had it cut in across, and when it was that you got a full page spread, it was something that really took your attention. And because I was only about 14 or 15 when I first read it, that was something that I didn't really appreciate because of the fact that I hadn't read too many comics. Now that I go back to it, I like that it does still have that kind of Silver Age format, but it adapts it in a way that the story can use. As well, I really enjoyed the colouring of this book. And in all honesty, I'm not sure if this has been done already, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, which, you know, most people enjoy doing anyway. But I am surprised that this hasn't been recoloured. It does give me that more classic vibe as if it was that you were getting this from a newsstand. It's very selective in the colours that it uses, and it's very bright and solid, and it's something that you don't really see utilised a lot now. It felt like when I go on Instagram and I just turn the contrast up and then all of a sudden everything's pretty much a flat colour. And I know it's something that a lot of people might not enjoy because of the fact that we've now got modern colouring, which is a bit more expansive, but sometimes that simplistic approach can work, and I think it does here. If it was recoloured, I think it wouldn't really feel the same. Like the scenes where it's sat on Mars and you've got the pink sands, I just think it's very beautiful, whereas if you did recolour it, that would probably look more like actual sand, and I'm not sure I'd like that.
I don't like sand.
But yeah, the art is still great and really enjoyable, and I do think it's one of the driving forces of this book, and I think it's often overlooked because of the fact that the story is just so, I don't even know what the word I'm looking for is. Prolific? Is that an actual word? Have I just invented another word? But when I reviewed Batman Hush, I said that that was a book where the art is the driving force of the story, but Watchmen is the exact opposite of that, and I do feel like the art is often an overlooked component. But the core story of Watchmen is just fascinating, and there's just so much that this book does well, because I know when something gets a lot of hype, it's often easy to look at it a bit more negatively, and because Watchmen is one of the most acclaimed books of all time, it's difficult to separate it from the hype that's been built. By no means is this a perfect book, but I think the way it paces the murder mystery aspect of it is just done really well. Considering that it opens the book and it carries through towards issue 12, it never felt like there was a moment where it was dragging its feet or that it needed to speed up or that it was just doing it to get a couple of extra issues out. If anything, it feels like there's a 24 issue world that's been crammed into 12. And I think one thing that did help with that pacing is having more than one main character, rather than just having one person guiding the full thing. Because that brings me on to one of the criticisms of this book, but I do think that these characters are actually too dense. And not dense in the insulting way, I just feel like there's so much that goes into them that they almost don't feel like real people. Near enough every single one of the main characters is too much on their own. It just got to a stage where I felt like everything they were saying was just exposition, whether it be on their own past or what they're thinking in that moment, and it just never left me with that opportunity to try and infer exactly what was going on. Because it was about halfway through this book that I found myself wondering, did Alan Moore value his own words over the actual art? Because there is kind of the Silver Age effect going on here, that sometimes there's so many word balloons that you miss out on the details that Dave Gibbons has put onto the panel. Sometimes it is intentional when there's quite a few people talking at once, but there were instances in this book where I would actually turn the page and just see how many words there were before I started reading it. Yeah, I know I sound really stupid for saying that. And I'm not trying to tell Alan Moore how to write a book, but I just think for myself, I would have probably enjoyed it more if it didn't need to tell me absolutely everything. And when I speak to people who don't enjoy this book, that's one of their criticisms of it, and I do think it's something that would affect a modern reader. But it just felt like every line of dialogue bled into a monologue or a flashback, and it just kind of got a bit grating towards the end. Like, with it being that there's pretty much 6 main characters in this book, would it really have been a massive crime if they just didn't tell us Rorschach's backstory? Now, don't get me wrong, that was probably the backstory that I enjoyed the most, but I do remember the first time that I was reading this, I didn't really have a clue exactly what Rorschach's deal was. Was he some kind of alien? Was he deeply disfigured? Was he a different incarnation of Dr. Manhattan that now just puts on a mask? So as fascinating as I found his backstory, it actually would have made him a more interesting character if I didn't know. Or even better yet, because of the fact that he's talking to a psychiatrist, they could have even made it a Joker-like situation that you aren't even sure if he's telling the correct story. Now again, that might just be a me thing and you think that sounds like a horrible idea, but it was one of the things that I had a problem with as I was going through this book. However, considering the time that it was released, it was really amazing to see how it crafted its narrative without needing a ton of narration, but instead it found a way to make its narration organic, kind of like what we had with Rorschach's journal. That effectively does the same job, but it does it in an in-universe way that doesn't really feel like it's intruding. And I'll admit, I'm not exactly sure what the benchmark was before this time, but I can't help but feel that this is one of the reasons why this book is still so successful, because it was changing the way that you looked at comics without actually changing its initial structure. But I'm gonna have to get into my biggest gripe with this series. There is way too much book in this comic. I genuinely at parts felt like Alan Moore probably would have had a better time if he would have just written a novel. Probably the biggest appeal of a comic is being able to have art that guides the story, but I feel like that is something that's not really respected here. And in all honesty, because of the fact that this wasn't my first time reading, I skipped the majority of the stuff like Hollis's diary and some of the news articles and stuff like that that were featured at the end of every issue. I think I read it the first time round, I can't really remember too much of what was said, and I don't even feel like it negatively impacted my experience this time round. It's great that Alan Moore has crafted this entire universe and he knows every single detail that goes into it, but half of the fun of it is not knowing it ourselves. But as soon as you start expanding on it, it kind of loses its mystique when it is that you know exactly what it is. And it felt like the exact same situation here with Watchmen, and if it is that you're including stuff that is easily skippable and doesn't really add anything to the experience, is there any real point in bringing that out? Why not do that as some kind of like separate handbook or a special issue for those people who want that? And it's just ironic because of the fact that I've already praised the actual pace that we have in this book, but then it's actually slowed down by stuff that isn't even necessary and you can easily skip. That might sound like a minor complaint, but when it happens in every single issue and there's also characters that don't really add anything to the overall story, it kind of gets on your nerves a bit. And in a similar fashion, I'm not afraid to admit that I don't read the pirate part. Even when I was reading this the first time round, I read the first couple of excerpts of it and then I just started skipping it. And it's not a great look for your book when I'm enjoying skipping parts of it because it means that I can get through it quicker. But for me, the pirate part is just fluff for the sake of fluff. I'm actually half tempted to do a separate video looking at the pirate part of Watchmen, telling you exactly what it's about and why it came to be. And if that's something that you do want to see, make sure you give this video a thumbs up and let me know in the comment section below. But I get that it's a more condensed version of the story that's happening and the impending doom. But to me, if you need a book within your book to tell the story of the book, then your book probably doesn't have the right book in its book.
Wait, what?
But it ties back into what I was saying earlier, that it just felt like there was too much hand-holding when it's very evident what's going on in the story to begin with. Like, I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I don't think there's going to be too many people that enjoy the pirate part of Watchmen more than the Watchmen part of Watchmen. And yes, I understand that it's all part of the same story, but at the end of the day, I skip it and I still don't really miss out. But that kind of brings me to my biggest gripe with Watchmen, and that's that there's so much subtext in this book that it often takes away from the main narrative. Like, it's to the point where if I had a facial hair for every bit of subtext that's in Watchmen, I'd probably have a full beard for once. And for me, I've just never really enjoyed stories where it feels like the symbolism and the messages that are going on behind the scenes are more important than the story that it's trying to tell. Like, I don't know if I've told this story before, but I'm just going to put some video game footage over it just so that people can still stay engaged with the video. But when I was at university, I did a creative writing class, and there was honestly this girl in there that all she wrote about was metaphors and symbolism. Me, on the other hand, I was writing dumb shit. I was writing some of the most fun stories that I've ever created. So far, I still want to win that Man Booker prize. But genuinely, she wrote a 10,000 word story about an old guy who burnt some beans. That is literally the plot. An old guy opened a tin of Heinz beans because there was that much detail that she had to say the brand. I don't know, maybe she was sponsored by Heinz at the time when she was writing it. He got a pan out, he realised that he needed to wash it, so he washed the pan, he used fairy washing up liquid because, again, product placement. And the old guy put the beans on his stove, which to me just said that he was way more middle class than I'd ever be, because I'd just put that kind of crap in the microwave. And then because the doorbell rang, he forgot about his beans and he burnt them. And if you were bored by me telling that story and were pretty much just watching the video game footage, just imagine how bored my entire class was when we had to read a 10,000 word version of that. I swear I had a point when I first started that story. But what I'm getting at is that even though Watchmen does still have its main narrative that it's got going on, it often felt like it was more concerned about the messages that it was trying to deliver to you. Now, I can't lie, Alan Moore is infinite times more intelligent and knowledgeable than myself, which I can't lie would not be a difficult competition for anyone to beat me at. But for me, a book or a comic or a graphic novel, a movie, a song, whatever it is, first and foremost is a method of entertainment. If you've got a deep message that you really want to tell so badly, that is what essays are for. Because the most frustrating bit when I was reading this is that I enjoyed the main story of the murder mystery that was surrounding the comedian. I even liked the impending doom that was going on with Russia and seeing how all the little pieces play their part. But honestly, after they'd appeared quite a number of times, I did not care about the news agent and his wife and the issues that he was having. And there was just so many other little aspects like this that it felt like it never knew exactly what it could drop, what it could bring back in, or exactly where it needed to go. And I think this story would have genuinely benefited from cutting out a few of those subplots. The only thing that I will say is that it did really help with the world building, which is something that I do commend this book for. And again, there are parts of this, and this isn't a massive spoiler, but the story of Rorschach's therapist, where he's slowly investigating into him and becoming more cynical as it goes on, that was a part that I really enjoyed. And I did like the story about the doctor who was recommending that depressed guy to go see a comedian. So there are those little bits seeded throughout that I did really like, but I just felt that the majority of it was just filler. But I also know that there are people who enjoy every single aspect of this book, so I'm probably in the minority here. And this is a weird bit of praise, especially from me, but I often found myself forgetting that this was created by two British people. There's such an understanding for American history and New York, which is evident in both Alan Moore's dialogue and also Dave Gibbons' art, but you would genuinely think that they lived in America their entire lives and they understood everything that was going on. I think that really just speaks to the credit of both of these creators, and in particular Alan Moore, that any book that he does, he knows exactly who he's talking about, where they exist, and how exactly they would speak. And despite everything that is crammed into this book and that I feel like it can often be overcrowded, it's still evident that Alan Moore knows everything that's going on in this world. And you also got the sense that he knew beyond that. You get the feeling like he knew exactly what was happening before issue 1 even began. The biggest credit to that is Dr. Manhattan's issue, and that was a very well handled issue. I think from a writing standpoint, that one's probably my favourite. And for as much as I'm bashing just how much is crammed into this book, it's not really anything that's bad, it's just not to my taste. Even if you don't enjoy this comic, you can see the work that's gone into it. And I think the biggest praise that I can give to Watchmen is the fact that it is different every time that I read it. There's always something new that I notice or something that I forgot was in this book. And even though it wasn't as as great as the reread that I had of Why the Last Man when I reviewed that book, there was still little details and aspects that I found myself appreciating that I probably wouldn't have noticed the times before. So even though I am finding myself being quite critical of a lot of the subtext, I do get the feeling that if I read this again in a couple of years, maybe it wouldn't bother me anymore. But we are going to be jumping into the spoiler section now, so if you don't want anything else ruined about this book, in particular the ending, I'd recommend skipping to the final verdict timestamp down below. Or if you are jumping out at this point in the video, thank you for watching. Make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Share it where you can because I'm trying to get this channel back on its feet. And feel free to check out one of my other reviews. So this is your final spoiler warning, and I am jumping in at the deep end because I really liked Ozymandias' plan. I thought him being behind the murder and faking his own assassination attempt and trying to do whatever he could to avert a war between America and Russia was just great, because for all I've already complained about how much is layered into this book, those build-ups were something that really paid off in the end. Seeing the growing tension between those two warring factions, when Dr. Manhattan left the planet and how that affected how America viewed their own safety, all of this was really logical and handled well, and I like that the smartest man on the planet could somehow figure what near enough everybody else on the planet was going to do. Because it's one of those stories where they have a character who is of course the smartest in the room, but not because of the fact that everybody else around them gets dumber when they are there. Sometimes that's often what can happen, and I'm glad they didn't fall into that trap. And sure, yes, you could argue that Rorschach and Night Owl did manage to figure it out, but at the point where it was already too late. And on this reading, I did find myself wondering what it would have been like if Night Owl would have got back in his costume a bit earlier. Would they have managed to prevent everything? And because of the fact that Dr. Manhattan was actually convinced that the plan was logical and correct, would it have even mattered if they did find out earlier? But yeah, it is one of those situations that when you go back and think of it, there isn't really any step in the plan that you'd probably get rid of. And I like that it made the comedian's murder a bit more personal, but at the same time it wasn't really for a personal reason, so it's got this really good balance between it. The giant squid monster though is still a bit weird, and this just proves my point that you can foreshadow whatever you want, but it's not going to make it any more sensical. Like, I haven't really touched on the Zack Snyder movie much. I think I only really watched it when it came out and it wasn't really something that I enjoyed, but using that kind of energy bomb was the one thing where I think it improved over its source material. And over the years I have seen people trying to defend why this is actually a good choice, but for me it just looks goofy. And you'd think it'd be the same in this world, considering the fact that it's already been quite grounded. A lot of the heroes are either explained why they've got powers, or they're pretty much just street level vigilantes. Had it been the case that during one of the many flashbacks they showed that the crime busters did actually fight monsters, it might have made a bit more sense. But it does just feel a bit out of left field, considering the fact that up until this point it's been very grounded and serious, and even Dr. Manhattan is pretty much based entirely in science. Like, I can chalk a lot of things up to suspension of disbelief, but you have to have it within the rules that you've set out from the beginning. And if you'd never read Watchmen before, but you've just finished the first issue, and then somebody told you that by the end New York's going to be destroyed by some kind of squid, you'd probably end up dropping the book because it sounds like it's going to jump the shark, or squid in this case. However, Rorschach's death still hits pretty hard. I loved that he was the one character that knew that what they were doing wasn't right. Even though it might have averted a war, it doesn't mean that it was the only way possible. And he didn't have the answer, but he knew that he had to try and find it. And I like that it kind of put a seed of doubt into my head that if you thought about it a little bit more, would there have been some other way to avert this crisis? Was it necessary to destroy New York? Like, I know we had Ozymandias' explanation, but admittedly, he is going to be a little bit biased. And it's just the fact that he's killed off so quickly, and we've probably been conditioned to the fact that the hero will pretty much always survive. And in literally one panel, he's just completely disintegrated. It was something that still takes me by surprise, no matter how many times I read this. It also made me judge Sally and Daniel a little bit harsher because of the fact that they didn't stick to what they believed in. And I don't really know where I sit on this fence or what I'd do, and I like that it brings in that question of morality. This is the type of subtext that I enjoy that can actually advance the story, but at the same time allow me to reflect. Another death that I think is really impactful but often gets overlooked because of the 12th issue is Hollis's. I always forget just how brutal this is, and it's one of the ones that does also take me by surprise because of the fact that I mostly just remember the last issue. But seeing Daniel hear about that, react to it, and then try to get his own back was just something that I thought was great for that character. But I wish Daniel would have killed Dave rather than it would have been that he just got killed by the monster, because it didn't really feel like a payoff. And I get that, yeah, it could be proving that near enough every action action that we take is pretty much meaningless. But still, I just wish that we could have had a bigger moment there. But speaking of which, I thought Sally and Daniel were a great couple. I liked that they put you in a position where you didn't really like her being with Dr. Manhattan, and that you had Night Owl, who's this really sweet guy. And I really enjoyed that it gave them time to actually develop that relationship, even though I do realise now that it pretty much happened over like a 2-week period. But still, in terms of when you're actually reading the story, it doesn't feel rushed or forced, and it felt like these two probably always had a connection. And I appreciate that we got a scene with them two at the end, even though they were in disguise, but it just proves the fact that they can still stay together even though they aren't adventurers anymore. Because that was one of the questions that I felt it brought up in the story. Are they just doing this because they're attracted to each other's personas rather than each other? Or is it just the fact that Daniel offers Sally that type of adventurer lifestyle that Dr. Manhattan couldn't? Because of the fact that if you're in a fight and you've got him by your side, you're pretty much always going to win. As well, I just loved all the little gadgets that were in Archimedes, and I'd really like a toy of that. Sorry, I have to say collectible now because I'm nearly 30. But yeah, just that sense of heritage and history was something that I did really enjoy throughout this book. I like that Daniel wasn't the first Night Owl, and that there was a Silk Spectre before Sally. That there had been two different superhero teams that emerged in very different eras and had different challenges. You know, you got your Golden Age take on it where everybody was pretty much an idealistic hero. Then you got the Silver Age where things had developed and you had more anti-heroes that were in the mix. And I think that's why I find the comedian being Sally's father to be a really interesting twist. Now, I can't really use twist in the normal notion of the word because of the fact that I have read this book a few times, but it's one of those weird plot points that it doesn't really derail the book, and I feel like if it hadn't been in here, it wouldn't really affect the overall plot, but in the same time, it just builds into everything that's been going on. We'd already had the flashbacks between the comedian and Sally Jupiter, so we'd seen it themselves, so it was a bit of a revelation to us. But one thing that did really bug me on this read through that I never really noticed until somebody pointed it out, but Alan Moore does really like relying on I can't say the word because of demonetization, but you probably know what I mean. And I know that in this book, it was what led to the comedian being Sally's father, but at the same time, I can't help but notice it now. Like, I spoke about this in my Joker review that I did last year, and I think I actually pointed to Watchmen as being an example of when you can use R to actually further your story. But now it did feel a bit weird because of the fact that I've read other Alan Moore books, and it also seems to crop up there. So this time round, I was thinking to myself, was there a way that they could have told the same story without that having to happen? Like, I'm not really going to sit here and pretend that I understand the intricacies of a situation like that. And you know, my heart goes out to anybody that has been a victim of that. So for me, it might be a bit easier for me to say, oh yeah, you can include this in your story if you're actually going to use it to further your plot. So yeah, it is kind of weird for me talking about this kind of thing, and I'm not really going to linger on it too much because, as you can tell, I don't really have a lot of knowledge on it. But I think out of all the situations where Alan Moore has brought R into one of his books, this is probably the only one where I felt like it actually benefited the story. It's weird though, and I'm not sure if it's because of the fact that this isn't the first time that I've read Watchmen. I don't really feel like there's much more else that I want to talk about in spoilers. Yeah, I probably could talk a little bit about the prison escape and how I felt that that was cool, and probably one of the best action moments in the book, but don't really feel like I've got too much else to say. I think I might be doing a video with Off My Shelves and we might talk about the book a bit more in depth, so make sure that you subscribe to his channel so that you can check that out when he uploads it. But yeah, this might proportionally be the shortest spoiler section in one of my reviews. This is my final verdict, and Watchmen will always be one of the most important titles in comic book history. It's been 35 years since it was first released, and I don't think it's ever left the graphic novel's bestsellers list. It's the comic that non-comic fans end up reading, but I don't think that any of these accolades can improve the reading experience. I've read this book a number of times throughout the years, and I think I've mentioned that I've read this book a number of times throughout this video, but I get a slightly different experience each time that I go back to it. There's so much depth to it that it's hard not to see something new, but if I'm being honest, this time round it felt like these 12 issues were a bit of a grind. In the same time that it took me to read this book, I managed to read 8 hardcovers of The Walking Dead. But I think that just says something more about the development of comics in the 35 years since it debuted, rather than the actual quality of the book itself. Watchmen will always be important, and I can't ever see myself having a bad time when I'm between these pages. But perhaps maybe some of the elements of this book that I glossed over when I was younger are now a bit more apparent. But I did find myself noticing that the dialogue does often drown out the art, and takes away some of the mystery that is often fun to infer. The ending still doesn't feel quite natural, and the pirate part, it's still there. But regardless of how many times I do read this, the pace is still great, the characters are still interesting and feel fully fleshed out, and there's a concept here so great that there's many other superhero comics that have tried to replicate it or do it a slight bit different in the years that have followed since, but have rarely managed to match exactly what Watchmen brings to the table. Watchmen is always worth a read, even if it is beginning to show its age a bit now. And regardless of the experience, whether you're a fan of this book or not, it's always worth remembering exactly what this did for comics. But before I give my final score, it's something that I wanted to develop a little bit more, maybe into its own video, but is it the case that Watchmen was the pinnacle of its time, or was it a book that was always going to exist? Like, if it hadn't have been Watchmen, would there have been another creator that would have come with something else that would have had the same effect? But unlike Watchmen, I can't rewrite history and I can only judge the book that I've got in front of me. So I'm going to give this a very decent and respectable 68%. Woof woof! So I guess that's the video and I'm hoping that you've enjoyed it, but until next time, just make sure that you stay safe and stay mad, all you dogs. Woof woof! See you at the next video.